I work with a lot of different players on managing the fear of failure during their games. And something that we talk a lot about is the idea of how when you respond to mistakes in a certain way, this will affect the amount of fear that you play with. And I often break it down into three different parts of how we want to be looking at mistakes in terms of the fear of failure. And that's what I want to discuss with you, how we can look at mistakes differently before games, respond to mistakes differently during games, and then also how we evaluate mistakes after games, and how all of that either makes you have more fear going into a game or can help reduce the amount of fear that you play with. Hey there, I'm Eli Straw, mental performance coach and the founder of SuccessStartsWithin.com. Now, the fear of failure in sports just refers to this idea of you being afraid of making mistakes. When you play with this type of fear, it's very natural to start playing to avoid mistakes. And this is where you find yourself holding yourself back, playing timidly, playing scared, playing safe, and all in all, just underperforming. Now, a lot of times when you do play with fear, something that can be pretty interesting is that you might not make a whole lot of mistakes. The reason you might not make a lot of mistakes is because you are holding yourself back. But then when you end up holding yourself back, you feel disappointed and frustrated afterwards, not because you made mistakes, but because you know that you played below your potential. And when we look at that and we know that there's this clear aversion to mistakes, we need to ask ourselves, well, why am I so afraid of making mistakes in the first place? Well, number one, we know that mistakes are not what you want to make, right? You don't set out and you begin a game saying, I want to make mistakes today. That's my goal for the day. We know that. So it's natural that mistakes become something that we don't want to have happen. But there's a huge difference between you knowing that mistakes will hurt your game versus you having an avoidance mindset towards mistakes. An avoidance mindset toward mistakes means that you cannot make mistakes. Mistakes are something that you have to avoid at all costs. When you have that type of mindset to mistakes, you find yourself playing with fear and you find yourself underperforming. So now the way that we are going to be looking at mistakes in the first place plays a huge role in how much fear we play with. And so that brings me to this first part, or to this first way of how we want to be viewing mistakes. So going into games, if you see mistakes purely as something negative, purely as something that you need to avoid at all costs, doesn't it make sense that you will play with fear and you will play in a way that works to avoid mistakes? Now, if you play in a way that works to avoid mistakes, will you find yourself playing aggressively? Will you find yourself playing up to your potential? Will you find yourself taking the necessary risks to separate yourself from the competition? You won't be playing with aggressiveness and be playing with that level of confidence that you need to be playing with because we know that avoiding mistakes is the number one priority. If we can change the way you see mistakes in the first place, this is going to help you get to the point where you are no longer playing with that level of fear and avoidance. So right now, if you're playing with the fear of failure, it's safe to assume that you see mistakes as purely negative. So going into games, you're thinking, I don't want to make any mistakes. How can we change that, right? Because to be honest with you, we're not going to go from I need to avoid all mistakes to I love making mistakes. Mistakes are fun, and that's what I want to accomplish. I want to make a bunch of mistakes today. That's not what we're trying to do. But what we are trying to do is see mistakes in a productive way. And so what I talk to athletes about is this idea of mistakes being inevitable. So if I know that mistakes are inevitable, I know that they're probably going to happen, right? Very, very few athletes always play perfectly. If any athlete ever plays perfectly, right? I've never come across one. So we know that mistakes will happen. If I know that something is inevitable, I know that it's a pretty high chance that it's going to happen during a game. Does it make a lot of sense for me to then play to avoid that thing? Or does it make more sense for me to figure out how do I play knowing that that thing probably will happen? Well, if I'm going to play knowing that mistakes will likely happen, I need a way of seeing mistakes in a productive way. And the way that we're going to be looking at mistakes is to learn. So going into games, the shift that we want to make is we want to go from seeing mistakes as something purely negative and something that you want to avoid to seeing mistakes as a way to learn and improve. What this means is we accept mistakes. We accept the possibility of mistakes, and we say that, hey, if I make a mistake, that's okay because I can use it to learn and improve. Now, there's a very fine line here between the idea of not caring about how you play and not caring if you make mistakes versus accepting the possibility of mistakes. And that's probably a whole deeper conversation. But when you accept mistakes, it doesn't mean that you don't care how you play. It doesn't mean that you don't care if you make mistakes. Accepting mistakes mean you accept the possibility of them, so we are no longer playing to avoid mistakes. Now, when I accept that, hey, I might make a mistake, what does that free me up to do? It frees me up to play the way I want to play confidently, to play aggressively, because I can say that if I make a mistake, it's something that I accept, so it's okay, so I no longer need to play or alter my play to avoid that. So that's the first kind of shift that we want to make. We want to go from seeing mistakes as negative to seeing mistakes as ways to learn, and so we're going to accept those mistakes going into games. Now, during games, the way that you respond to mistakes is going to have a huge role not only on the amount of fear that you play with for the rest of that game, but also the amount of fear that you play with moving forward. So during games, if I respond to mistakes negatively, meaning I get down on myself, I get upset, I end up making more mistakes because I cannot let go of that previous mistake, what do you think will happen to the amount of fear I play with that game? The amount of fear I play with that game will increase because now I don't want to make another mistake. I've already made one mistake. I'm down on myself. Maybe coach yelled at me a little bit. Maybe I'm afraid of what my teammates think of me. So now I desperately want to avoid any future mistakes. Then what do you think will happen if I keep responding negatively to mistakes during games, game after game after game? What I do there then is I create a strong association between mistakes and negative feelings. If I have an association between mistakes and negative feelings, then that only strengthens this idea of I want to avoid mistakes, because I will avoid situations that cause me to feel negative. So during games, I'm going to be playing safe because I want to avoid mistakes, since mistakes are a time where I'm going to get down on myself and I'm going to feel frustrated and upset. Therefore, I need to avoid them. If we can respond differently, so if we can respond in a better way and a more productive way to mistakes during games, this takes away a lot of the fear, because it takes away a lot of that negative response and the negative feelings that we have post mistakes. So the main idea here during games is that we want to adjust if we need to, but then most importantly, we want to refocus and move on quickly. So the adjustment part comes into play if you made a mistake that you need to learn from mid-game. So an example would be if you make a bad pass and then you decide, okay, next time I need to do this or I need to do that. Or you have a bad at bat and you say, next time I need to wait back on the ball a little bit more. Or you make an error in the field and next time you say, okay, I need to charge that ball. It's just a quick adjustment that you would make. But now we don't want to get hung up on that adjustment, and we don't want to start overthinking the adjustment. Overthinking the adjustment is something that I see a lot in athletes, to where they're starting to overthink why they made that mistake, what they need to do differently next time, and they never actually give themselves the opportunity to move on to that next time. So once we adjust, and remember, we want to adjust quickly and we want to make a simple adjustment, then it's time to move on. So refocus, get yourself ready to make that next play. This isn't something that is easy, right? But when we recognize the unhelpful nature of, number one, holding on to mistakes during games, but also getting too down on ourselves during games, then we see the necessity to move on as quickly as possible and to get ourselves refocused for that next play. And once again, this is strengthened and made easier when we initially have the mindset going into games of I accept the possibility of mistakes and I use mistakes to learn. Because when I go into games and I say I need to avoid mistakes, I cannot make any mistakes, what ends up happening is if I make a mistake, it's about 10 times more likely that I will get frustrated because I have failed with my initial goal. My initial goal was to avoid mistakes. I made a mistake, therefore I failed. However, if I accept that mistakes will likely happen, and I, more importantly than just accept that, I say that, hey, I use mistakes to learn, so they're not something that's purely negative, I'm in a much better position to actually adjust and move on quickly mid-game. So that's the second way that we need to look at mistakes when it comes to this fear. We need to adjust and move on quickly mid-game when mistakes happen. The last thing that we need to look at is how we actually evaluate mistakes post-game. So I work with a lot of athletes on being too critical of themselves. So after games, they get too hung up on what they did wrong, they focus on those negatives, they dwell on them, and then they beat themselves up moving forward. And just this past week, I was talking with an athlete who I'm working with in one-on-one coaching, and he was explaining to me how he focuses on these negatives because those are the things he needs to improve. And that is absolutely true. But we have to ask ourselves, are we really looking at these negatives and these mistakes in a way to improve, or is all we're really doing lowering our confidence because we are just being too critical of ourselves? Mistakes during games are powerful, powerful teachers if you use them in the right way. If you simply get stuck on these mistakes and beat yourself up, that only increases fear moving forward. So now we've got the acceptance of mistakes pre-game, and then we have the adjustment and the moving on during the game, and then afterwards we need to evaluate with the intent to improve. Not evaluate with the intent to beat ourselves up and point out all the reasons why we played poorly today. It's, okay, what were the mistakes that I made today? How do I learn from them? And then how will I actually get better at those things? So this is where you then will have goals that you set for practice and for your next game, to where you are aiming at improving upon the mistakes you made instead of simply getting down on yourself. Changing the way you look at mistakes like this is one of the best and the most effective ways I've found for managing your fear when it comes to making mistakes during games. Because again, if we initially see mistakes as something that we need to avoid, we will play safe. And then if we want to avoid mistakes and we make mistakes during games, it's much more likely we're going to get upset at ourselves. So then post-game, we're just going to look back and we're going to beat ourselves up, criticize what we did, which is only going to lead to more fear and more worry about making further mistakes in the future. If we can completely shift the way we see mistakes, not seeing mistakes as something we want to have happen, not saying we don't care about mistakes, but taking more of an accepting approach to mistakes and a learning approach to mistakes. You take something that is inevitable, right? Something that we know all athletes face, which are mistakes, and you learn how to actually use it to better your performance moving forward instead of having this fear of mistakes continue to hold you back. So make sure that moving forward, you accept mistakes, right? You accept the possibility of them, and you take this learning approach. You try to adjust and move on quickly during games. And then after games, let's look back. Let's think, how can we learn from those mistakes? And then most importantly, put what you learn into practice moving forward. And this is going to help you let go of that fear and play aggressively, confidently, and play freely during your games. If you're interested in learning more about one-on-one mental performance coaching or any of the sports psychology programs that I have available, I've put links to those in the description below, or you can head over to successstartswithin.com to learn more. Thank you for watching the video, and I wish you the best of success in all that you do.